Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm joined by none other than Dr. Eric Trexler. We're going to be diving deep into the science and strategies behind making fat loss easier. Fat loss isn't easy, but can we make that journey a bit more comfortable? I wanted this to be a go-to resource for yourself, for your clients, for your loved ones, to send to them or refer back to help your fat loss journey. So we're going to be starting off with the size of calorie deficit and finding the right balance for you in terms of that size, macronutrient management, looking at protein, is it the most satiating of the macros, how important are carbohydrates and fats for satiety, then diving into food composition, the benefits of less processed foods, harder foods, mindful eating practices, and targeting low energy density foods. Then how important is meal timing and frequency? Does chrononutrition play a key role? And obviously supplementation. Is there anything we can do? We have a little bit of a look at expandable no-calorie gel capsules, caffeine, Yohimbine, L-Carnitine. We'll discuss their potential benefits and the science behind their use and much more. As a reminder, guys, we are proud affiliates to the Mass Research Review, which came up several times in today's discussion. If you like deep dives just like this, you will love the Mass Research Review that covers the latest science relating to hypertrophy, strength, and much more. You can find more via the link in the description. And without further ado, join us as we uncover the latest insights and practical tips to help you achieve your fat loss goals with one of the best minds in the field. Whether you're just starting out your journey or looking to refine your approach, this episode is packed with valuable information you will not want to miss. So let's dive in. Eric, today we're going to be talking all about nutritional strategies to make fat loss easier. As I said off air to you, I want this to be a go-to resource for people who, if they're struggling with their diet, what can they do? We have basically everything that they could possibly hope for that they could change with their diet to make the process as easy as it can be, because dieting sucks for many people. There's a short honeymoon phase, I kind of call it, but after that it kind of becomes much more challenging. But to kind of start things off, calories, I think that's a great place to start. And I think a lot of people will think, and I'm not actually sure if we have an answer here or not, and so you're the prime person I want to ask, that the larger your calorie deficit, the more hungry you're going to be. So if you're like struggling with hunger, be in a smaller calorie deficit. Is there that linearity of hunger to size of deficit? Does that hold true?
You know, I think if you look at the extremes, it holds true, right? So like you could imagine if you're someone who is at a very healthy, not just healthy, but a very comfortable body composition, and you're at maintenance and you say, I'm going to reduce my my daily calories by 50 a day. You're not even going to notice it, right? You're not going to have some spike in hunger just because you categorically moved from maintenance to deficit, technically on paper. Whereas if we look at the other extreme and you say, I think I'm just going to consume like an all liquid 700-800 calorie diet and ride this out until I'm shredded. Obviously, the first week of those two diets, they're going to look very, very different. They're going to feel very, very different. But I would say this, and this is something I've kind of evolved on as the years have passed. I think that some people probably put a little bit too much emphasis on getting the absolute perfect size of deficit. And there's not anything necessarily wrong with that in a vacuum. I understand, especially in the context of physique sport, why you would say, well, I want to have an acceptable rate of fat loss, but I don't want to be in an excessively large deficit because I still need to go into the gym and perform and maintain all my muscle, maybe even build muscle in the first portion of a weight loss diet. So I get that. And that's a legitimate set of considerations, especially, like I said, for a physique athlete. But I think a lot of people spend so much time kind of agonizing over the numbers and 50 calories here versus 50 calories there, which in the long run are probably going to get lost in the wash. And they're ignoring some lower hanging fruit in terms of kind of qualitative adjustments or strategies that they can utilize to make dieting at least feel a little bit easier. And again, we're using relative terms here, right? So if you have really ambitious weight loss goals, there's not a way to make that easy. We're just talking about easier from a subjective experience. And so there are some, little tips and tricks that we can get from the literature that are, they're evidence-based. They're solid dietary strategies that are backed up by really well-conducted, high-quality research. And yeah, I think my overall perspective is that for most people, there's a little too much emphasis on wondering if you should be eating 2,300 calories versus 2,400 calories. And there's probably not enough emphasis on some of these other strategies.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think it's, as you said, at the extremes, yeah, you're going to see big differences. But outside of that, because it's a dynamic system as well, 100 calories here or there, there's also energy output and the impacts on that anyway. So it's kind of like, hey, you're probably stressing a little bit too much. I think it's probably worth, at least I think people will be kind of wanting this answer if you have just general recommendations for approximate calorie deficits without risking muscle loss. Do you have a way about going about that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a pretty solid meta regression a couple years ago. I think the lead author was Murphy, and their meta regression indicated in a very oversimplified conclusion statement that I'm making, not putting it in the words of those authors. It looked like you probably don't want your deficit to be too much larger than 500 calories per day. If you're interested in really building muscle during a weight loss diet or retaining as much as you can as you're starting to get really lean. So that 500 calorie per day number seems to be, I think it's a pretty solid heuristic. I think it's useful. I think it puts us in the right ballpark where, I mean, Steve, you've coached people forever. If you've got someone on 100 calorie per day deficit, you're really spinning some wheels. You're not really getting anywhere in a timely manner. And at the same time, once deficits start getting up into the 1,000 calorie a day range, that's where things start to get pretty tough, pretty nasty. So 500, I think, is a pretty decent estimate. But I will say one of the things that's really unfortunate about the way that meta regression's been interpreted is they kind of plotted out, the size of the deficit versus changes in fat-free mass. And 500 calories per day was where that regression line crossed zero, basically indicating like, here's our cut point where once the deficit gets above 500 calories per day, you are now losing fat-free mass. And of course, that's a very extreme interpretation. Like, that is technically what the model is suggesting, but you have to remember that there's giant ranges of error around that intercept value, meaning, yeah, in most cases across these studies with very different dietary interventions and very different training programs with people with very different starting body fat levels, about 500 calories per day is a rough approximation. But I think a lot of people see that solid straight line. They look at where it cuts and they say, wow, we have a scientifically, perfect threshold here that's beyond reproach and can never be questioned. And of course, that's not really the proper interpretation.
I think that's so well said, because I think I've spoken to Menno about that and I have seen it quoted as well. And it's the unfortunate thing that people want black and white answers and they're like, right, 500 calories, that's my deficit. If I lose more than a pound in the week, which is, I guess, a pound roughly equates to that 3,500 in a pound of fat. So if I lose over that, they're now concerned they've lost muscle. It's like, I wouldn't rush to that conclusion because there's so many other variables, such as, I guess, the average person listening to this probably has better training quality, hopefully better sleep, maybe better nutritional practice overall that's going to lead
protein
to more
intake.
muscle retention. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because it's not like all these studies, people were eating 2.5 times the RDA of protein, which is not unusual for a bodybuilder, right? So yeah, there's all these different factors where I'd say, you know what, especially if you're a bodybuilder early in prep, I wouldn't be the least bit concerned if you find out, oh, we crunched the numbers, we've actually been in a 600 calorie per day deficit or even 700 calorie per day deficit. Because again, the early, you mentioned that kind of honeymoon phase early in a diet, and it's great, man. Like when you do the first third of a prep or the first half of a contest prep as a natural bodybuilder, people ask you what you've been doing to look so much bigger, not smaller, right? Your definition starts coming out. You're still feeling great, plenty of energy. All that stuff we're doing in the first third, the first half of our prep, we are basically doing the preparatory work for the real stuff. That's basically happening. And that doesn't diminish the importance. If we never get to the real stuff, then it never happens, right? So it's foundational, it's critical, but man, the best thing you can do for yourself as a bodybuilder is, instead of agonizing over details for 6 months, give yourself that first third or half of that prep to cruise a little bit and trust the process. Get to the part where we have to really start, nailing down every little variable in order to make that prep successful. But we have a lot of wiggle room in the first half. And when we start extrapolating these recommendations out to non-competitive, kind of non-physique athletes, we have a lot of wiggle room in basically the whole diet, right? Until we're trying to get really into that like sub 10% body fat level for males, maybe sub 18-ish, sub 17-ish percent body fat range for females. So yeah, I think it's important to recognize that there's plenty of wiggle room, and that 500 calorie per day number is a very rough estimate that has to be kind of contextualized based on all those other factors that impact fat-free mass.
Yeah, and that perfectly relates to, I know Eric Helms, not yourself, did a paper on like natural bodybuilder recommendations. Essentially, you're saying like, hey, at the start of a prep, 1% seems pretty reasonable of body weight to lose per week. As you get near the end, 0.5%, maybe even dipping below that as you're like towards the end, where scale weight changes become something hard to kind of follow, because there's maybe more fluctuations in water retention or bloat and that sort of thing, because there's such little body fat left to come off.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you think about a natural bodybuilder, I'm going to use American units, please forgive me, but a natural bodybuilder who's starting their prep at 200 pounds, if they're losing a couple pounds a week, 1% of body mass, I'm not worried about that at all. I mean, we could go and back calculate the exact deficit. It may in fact be more than 500 calories per day. But what do I care? We're probably starting our prep. If we're 200 pounds and we're natural and we're not 7'1", we're probably starting our prep with a decent amount of body fat to lose, or you're absolutely elite and none of these numbers matter to you anyway, because you're just like a freak of nature. I'm not going off meta regressions to figure out what's best for you. So yeah, I mean, 1% at the beginning of prep, no big deal. But then when you get to the end of it, I mean, man, when you're going to get on stage at 150 pounds or something like that as kind of a shorter stature natural bodybuilder, I mean, if you think you're still going to be losing, 1.5 pounds a week or even a pound a week that late into prep, I mean, things are going to really grind to a halt, and they probably should, right? When you start getting to that critically lean spot, that's the biggest mistake I've personally made as a bodybuilder. I'm very stubborn, and so I always have coached myself. Except for my very first prep ever, where I started with so much body fat, didn't give myself nearly enough time. Not my coach's fault, but I just didn't get that lean. But ever since then, I've always coached myself. And my worst habit as a bodybuilder is over dieting, because I'm willing to put up with all the awful crap of dieting. I just don't want to lose, right? So I'll get to that end and I'll push way harder than I should. And there's really substantial downsides of trying to maintain a high rate of weight loss late in prep. So I completely agree that, go ahead and start all the way up at 1%, even if that puts you, over a 500 calorie per day deficit. But when it gets to the end, you really want to rein that back. And by the end of it, you should really just be putting on the finishing touches. That last month of your prep, I'm hoping that you don't need to lose another 4, 5, 6 pounds of fat mass. Hopefully we've kind of taken a much more gradual approach.
Yeah, very well said. That sprint finish is never a fun time, and I could do a whole podcast probably on self-coaching versus having a coach and everything, but I already took us in a little bit of a tangent talking about that. So I'll get us back to, I guess, macronutrients now. So a lot of people be aware of protein. I think a lot of people will think protein is the most satiating macronutrient. It has a high thermic effect of feeding. Can we dig into some of those kind of assumptions?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, protein, obviously, if you're someone who's dieting, it's going to be super helpful first and foremost, because it should help with some fat-free mass retention. Not going to bother convincing a lot of people of something they already believe, something that's been shown in the evidence pretty consistently. So obviously we're going to be on a fairly high protein diet if we're dieting, trying to get pretty lean, and we want to maintain fat-free mass and muscle mass. But when it comes to effects on satiety, things are not really all that simple. So like in the broadest sense, again, if we zoom out and look at the extremes, we've got someone who's eating the RDA, maybe they're eating like 50 grams of protein a day and they're dieting pretty hard. And the other person's eating triple that. They're eating 150 grams a day, which is not unusual for a physique athlete. I am very confident that if we flip a switch and that first person just triples their protein intake and moves other carbs and fats around, they are going to feel it in terms of improved satiety. The thermic effect of feeding, I don't care that much about. You know, I do research now with doubly labeled water in Herman Pontzer's lab at Duke. And a lot of times we don't bother to measure thermic effect of feeding directly. You know, like there's a lot of bodies of research where if you just say, we'll call it 10% of total calories, most people are cool just riding with that, because at the end of the day, these little differences tend not to be very important when it comes to the thermic effect of feeding. But anyway, you know, these giant changes in protein probably do matter with regards to satiety. You know, we probably will get a satiating effect there. But there was a study by Faziano and colleagues in 2023 where they were trying to predict with different meal characteristics in these really well-controlled metabolic ward feeding studies what predictors are really impacting the amount of calories that someone consumes in these highly controlled meal settings. And surprisingly, the effect of protein intake was pretty negligible. But it's worth noting that the protein content of the meals only range from 10% to 28% of total energy. So it is possible that maybe when we start getting from moderate protein up into the really high protein intake ranges, maybe that's where we see more of a meal by meal satiating effect. There's also some interesting, that study kind of hinted at the idea that maybe the satiating effect of protein was larger in the context of ultra processed diets rather than less processed diets. And there's some food characteristics we can talk about later that might be impacting the effect of protein on satiety. Another really interesting thing is when we think about the time scale of the satiety effect. So there was a meta-analysis a few years back. I know I covered it in the Mass Research Review when it first came out. It's been years now, probably 3 years.
But they were looking by the Kahanamu et al. 2020. That might
it's
be
been so long ago that I don't remember the author name, but I do remember one of the kind of points of contention. One of the things that got people kind of worked up in the fitness space was you could look at the results and conclude that perhaps the effect of increasing protein on satiety, perhaps it wanes a little bit over time. So for instance, if we say, hey, you're prepping right now, you're struggling with hunger, we're going to go ahead and bump your protein robustly. We're going to give you a 30 gram per day bump in protein, move other things around to accommodate that. There is some meta-analysis evidence to indicate that perhaps you get an initial bump in satiety, but basically you just acclimate to it over time, and you kind of get used to it, start taking that extra protein for granted, kind of at a subconscious level, and you're no longer experiencing that really robust boost in satiety maybe a month or two later. So that is worth considering. Perhaps you have to go pretty high with the protein to get meal by meal satiating benefits. Perhaps those benefits can start to diminish over time as we kind of get used to them and habituate to them. And the final thing, which I think leads into some of those other food characteristics I talked about, when we think about the practical element of, Steve, you're my coach, and you said, hey, you know what? You've been really hungry lately. I'm going to let you boost your protein by 30 grams a day. And I say, fantastic. Now that's going to look really, really different for me. It's going to feel really different for me if I'm getting those extra 30 grams of protein from boring, kind of dry, not so well cooked chicken breast versus my favorite, unbelievably delicious liquid protein shake that tastes like a chocolate shake from a restaurant, right? And I wish that when someone in 2024 begins their fitness journey, I wish it were mandatory to make them try a protein shake from the early 2000s, because people these days don't know how good they got it in terms of the flavor, the texture, the mouthfeel of protein supplements these days. It is crazy. And even if you don't like a decadent chocolate shake, they're like, here, we've got these ones that taste like blue raspberry juice that have the consistency of water. It's just unbelievable how far that sector has come. But all of that is to say, satiety is more than just calories and macros. It's dramatically impacted by the characteristics of the food and the kind of contextual factors of that meal. And what that means is 30 grams of protein in terms of satiety looks very different from a bland, high volume chunk of meat versus a liquid beverage that has a completely different flavor profile and a completely different texture.
Yeah, really well said. I think, I don't know if I pronounce it well, but I have it in my notes because I took it from Mass, because I read that as well, the Kahana et al. 2020 meta-analysis. Because when I read that, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's going to get it got my back up a little bit as a bro, but it's not saying having a high protein diet isn't a good move for satiety. It's just saying, hey, you might not get those satiety effects long term. And if you bump it up, again, it very may well diminish. And I thought you brought up a great point with the composition of the protein. Another one people might think of is like digestion speed. So a casein-based protein, but like a Greek yogurt that's nice and thick, maybe slower digesting versus like a whey protein. Do you know if there's much kind of you can do with that to have an impact?
It's tricky because I think this is where I would make a bit of a distinction. And it's like it seems really annoying and kind of semantic. Might there be a difference between like casein and whey for hunger or for fullness? Maybe. I haven't seen that literature. Like you said, it would make sense. And then, of course, the difference between a liquid and a solid protein meal based on digestion speed, that makes all the sense in the world. But if I could be totally candid, I think a lot of times when people are talking about strategies to increase satiety during dieting, what they're really interested in are strategies to reduce desire to eat. And I think that's a huge difference that people don't delineate enough in the fitness space. And it wasn't until I got really into research in this area that I said, oh, wait a minute. We all kind of treat these things as if they're the same, and they're definitely not the same, right? So for instance, it's very possible that there could be this tiny minute difference between a chocolate whey shake and a chocolate casein shake in terms of actual, if I had you do a 0 through 100 scale of hunger and fullness, maybe we're nudging that by 5 or 6 points out of 100. But what I'm really interested in is if at noon I give you a chocolate whey shake or a chocolate casein shake or a big bland piece of chicken breast, and they're all protein and calorie equated, how much do you want to eat again at 2 p.m. or 3 p.m.? And I think that's mostly what people are interested in. And I think that's good because there are a lot of different meal and food focused characteristics that we can seek out that I think really can have a big impact on our desire to eat, which is usually what makes dieting suck. It's not that we necessarily have this constant physiological hunger. And frankly, by the end of prep, you will. There's nothing that we're really going to be able to do about that. But I think what really hits quality of life the most is that discrepancy between desire to eat and, frankly, the ability to eat more in a way that's still compatible with your goal. And I think there's some things we can do with meal composition that impact that.
Yeah, I think that delineation is so good. In my head, it's kind of like the difference between physiological true hunger and just your craving to eat because foods are tasty. And in regards to the speed of digestion thing, when I looked briefly into it, it seems like there hasn't been that much looking into it. Some has suggested whey is more filling in short term, casein is more filling in long term. But I think the last meta-analysis I saw that looked at it was just like, we don't really know if it has an impact because it's probably more related to things that you're suggesting in terms of food composition. I did want to, I don't know if you have anything to talk about with carbohydrates and fat. Obviously with carbs, people think about fiber. Fat, they're thinking it's calorie dense, but it slows digestion. So I don't know if there's much you want to talk about there.
Yeah, when it comes to fat, I don't think it's really worth the squeeze. When we're talking about really low calorie diets, right? And we're talking about dieting pretty hard, whatever modest impact that we're going to get on boosted satiety from slower digesting fats, and that's just fats in general, which do take considerably longer to digest. I just don't think it really moves the needle in terms of hunger and desire to eat. Because I mean, think about what 150 calories worth of oil looks like. It's kind of hard to convince yourself that putting that in your stomach is going to make a night and day difference between how much more you want to eat in 3 hours or 6 hours, right? So that's an area where I get away from focusing too much on these kind of mechanistically driven theories of what really ought to impact satiety. I think with fat, the trade-off between very high energy density and maybe a modest increase in satiety, I just don't think the numbers tend to work out for most people, which is why you do tend to see a lot of folks sometimes success does leave clues. And I know that's not a reason to ignore the scientific evidence, but sometimes it bolsters the scientific evidence a little bit. And I do think there's a reason why a lot of physique athletes, when you tell them as early prep switches into mid or late prep, hey, we got to cut some calories. Where do you want them to come from? A lot of people are more than happy to let the fat go. Because when you start cutting out the protein, we lose much more meaningful benefits with regards to satiety and muscle retention. When you cut out the carbohydrate, we're missing out on a lot of food volume, which has a huge psychological impact, I think. Again, getting to that desire to eat element. And we're also cutting out a lot of fiber, which has a much bigger impact on satiety by my read of the literature than anything we'd hope to get from slowing digestion via additional fat content. So yeah, with carbs and fat, I mean, there's no question that a nice high fiber diet is going to do you a lot of favors when it comes to managing hunger and desire to eat while dieting. With fat, I generally, if I'm dieting hard, I do tend to cut fat before I start making the really hard decisions because it is a little bit easier to let go of.
The only, it's just very random. I think that was really well explained. And anyone who's done a long diet or comp prep knows that you're completely right. Fat is the thing that everyone wants to kind of let go. In fact, some people struggle even to include enough of it early on with a diet because they're like, hey, I just want to have more food volume. I don't know if you're kind of read on any of the literature on nuts. I just remember seeing some interesting things on nuts that somehow they don't get round energy balance, I don't think, because I'd be very surprised if anything getting around the law of thermodynamics. But there's just some interesting bits and pieces coming out on kind of nuts and their impact.
And their impact in terms of being a kind of satiety boosting food?
I think it was just like their impact on energy intake and fat loss and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I've kind of been dancing around this idea of food characteristics that are modifiable that we might want to consider. And I figure I might as well just cut right to it and kind of talk through my kind of checklist of things I look for if I'm dieting, I'm struggling, I have really high hunger or desire to eat, different things I can do with a meal to kind of boost my my chances of success, or at least make this process a little more enjoyable. So one thing I like to do is avoid a ton of really ultra processed foods. Doesn't mean that ultra processed foods are across the board terrible. It's hard to get more processed than a whey protein shake. Whey is a fantastic protein source. I wouldn't say, hey, you got to cut that out of your diet, but you will start to see when you're getting late into a diet and things are getting hard, you might say, well, I could have that whey protein shake, or I could work in a piece of chicken or a piece of fish or something else that perhaps is giving me a little bit more bang for my buck in terms of satiety and desire to eat down the line. So avoiding a ton of ultra processed foods. And we do have studies that indicate that people do tend to passively overconsume ultra processed foods, likely because they just have a different mouthfeel and texture. They're just a little bit easier to consume. And to be completely honest, a lot of them are formulated very carefully to kind of hit that perfect spot with flavoring where it's really good, really hyper palatable, but not so good that it kind of extinguishes your desire to eat more, where it's like, okay, I've had enough, I'm fine, I don't want any more. And a lot of times people talk about that in this kind of conspiratorial way, like these big multinational food conglomerates are conspiring to give you obesity. And it's like, I don't see it that way. am no more quick to blame a food company for making a tasty, ultra processed food than I am if I'm out at a restaurant to walk back to the kitchen and kind of yell at the chef for making my dish too good, right? When we look at it in the small scale in a restaurant, we say, wow, this chef is incredible. My kudos to the chef. And then when it comes in a package, we say, who are these bastards trying to kill me, right? I don't really understand that discrepancy. So I'm not getting into some like conspiratorial thing, but when companies make these ultra processed foods, they make them in a way that has very enjoyable, very preferable mouthfeel and flavor profiles. And they are things that, humans are pretty simple. And I would even backtrack and say primates are pretty simple. When we got food that's easy to access and it's going down smooth and it tastes great and it's really high quality food, we as primates have a tendency to get a little overweight or even a little more than a little overweight. Dr. Ponser here at Duke wrote a paper within the past year about what he calls the provisioned primate. So we're in the Department of Evolutionary Anthropology, so we look at a lot of these questions through the lens of primate evolution. And what's really interesting is like you can do these comparative assessments of, a chimpanzee in the wild versus a chimpanzee that lives in provisioned conditions. Basically, if you're in a zoo or a sanctuary where we're feeding these chimpanzees, they don't have to struggle for food. They got all they want, and it's really, really high quality food, right? And you can do similar comparisons, arguably, if you look at people in very industrialized economies with very easy access to a variety of foods in markets and shopping centers versus individuals who are in kind of pre-industrial economies with pre-industrial food systems where you get your food by hunting, foraging, maintaining a herd, things like that. The food that you get, you didn't buy it, you cultivated it through one mechanism or another. And so what's really interesting is in his paper, he looked at, I think, literally like a couple dozen species of primate, ranging from like orangutans to chimpanzees to lemurs to humans. And there's a fairly comparable distinction or difference in terms of propensity to obesity when you compare a provisioned primate to a primate who's out in the wild kind of trying to gather food resources to the best of their ability. So I think it's really interesting to zoom out and say it's not that these companies are trying to kill us and doing bad things. It's that like we're primates, and it seems like primates, when food is easily accessible, we eat the stuff that feels great and is tasty and has great texture, and we tend to eat a little more than we need. And if we do that for 70 years, what do you know? We tend to accumulate body fat over time. So all of that is to say, I try to avoid really ultra processed foods, or at least a high proportion of them in the diet. And I try to avoid hyper palatable meals because we do find that aside from you get into the physiology of, digestion speed and all these other kind of factors and maybe how they affect this appetite hormone or that appetite hormone. I think with hyper palatable meals, you have to go from the gut, backtrack, zoom out a little bit and focus more on the brain. Right. So our eating behaviors are not just dictated by gastric physiology. Our eating behaviors are controlled by higher brain centers that are very much influenced by reward responses. Right. When we have things that make us feel good, we have all the kind of neuropeptide, responses that make us say, that kind of reinforce that behavior. Hey, great job. You found some great tasting food that's generally good for our survival. Great job. Here's some chemicals that make you feel really happy, right? So those reward centers can very easily override our more basic satiety and hunger cues and hunger signals, right? And so that's why, people always say, hey, nobody's getting obese eating chicken breast and plain chicken. Well, yeah, I mean, you eat that stuff, it's fine, but it's not giving this huge reward response in your brain that's going to override satiety signals. So when you eat enough, you say, yeah, I'm good. I don't need a third serving of plain chicken and broccoli, right? But when you're eating these really hyperpalatable foods, sometimes we will consume more than we physiologically need because that reward response is really what's dictating our continued feeding behavior even though we've had more than enough calories for what we need at the moment. So I avoid the ultra processed foods to some extent. I eat them in moderation. Same thing with hyper palatable foods. I eat them in moderation. And I do think that's a place where natural bodybuilders, especially, just because I've been tapped into that culture, 10 years ago, we really missed the mark with that stuff. Natural bodybuilders 10 years ago, it was like the Olympics of make the tastiest meal you possibly can out of fat-free this and sugar-free that. And people were making all these, and I was there, I was doing it. I was doing the fat-free Greek yogurt with the protein and the fat-free, sugar-free Jello mix, and you put in the PB2, and all of a sudden you've got this thing that tastes like a Reese cup or something, peanut butter and chocolate and all this decadent stuff. And I think we really missed the mark. And that was an area where we could have really learned from, the bros who were, largely competing in other federations, who are just like, yeah, I eat fish 2 out of my 4 meals, and I eat chicken the other 2, chicken, rice, broccoli, rinse and repeat, sweet potato. I do think there's some value in avoiding those hyper palatable meals that really light up some of those reward centers in the brain and cause that neurophysiological response that frankly is really tough to overcome when it comes to desire to eat. Another thing I wanted to mention here, though, so you brought up nuts, right? And I know I'm monologuing here, but I did want to get to this point before I kind of pause and take a breath. So nuts, they're not violating any rules of energy balance, like you said. But what's really interesting about nuts is that they're hard. You have to chew them, right? So eating nuts takes time, and they taste good, but they're not hyper palatable, right? You don't start eating almonds and say, I just can't put them down. At least most people don't. Now, when you cover them with dark chocolate, then that happens, right? So almond, whatever nut you prefer, it's kind of in that sweet spot of tasting good enough that you don't have to like force yourself to eat it, but it's not hyper palatable. And because they're so hard in texture, you have to chew them. And that does a couple things. First of all, there's evidence indicating that when you are eating stuff that has to be chewed a lot, obviously it's going to slow down your eating rate in general. If you have to do 6 chews instead of 2 chews, and you kind of extrapolate that over a meal per mouthful, we're really meaningfully slowing down the rate of eating, the rate of food consumption. And there's research indicating that, as you eat more slowly, you increase your ability to mount a robust satiety response within that meal, right? And so you might reach a point earlier in that meal where you say, okay, I've had enough, satiety's kicking in, I'm good to go. Another thing that's really interesting with eating slower, like I said, hard food textures is a way to do it. Chewy food textures is a way to do it. I think, aside from the volume in the gut, when we look at liquid versus solid meals, I think this is another area where that example I keep going back to, kind of a tough chicken breast that has to be chewed versus a chocolate shake that goes right down. I think that matters. But what's really interesting is with slow eating, researchers have made a pretty strong case that aside from just giving satiety hormones more time to react to the ingestion of calories, there's also an impact on our attention to the meal and our short-term memory of that meal and the sensory experience of that meal. So if you think about it, you've got a chocolate shake, you take 2 gulps, it's gone, versus a meal that you have to cut with a knife. That takes time. You put it in your mouth, you chew as many times as you need. And the whole time that you're chewing that, you are engaging with the sensory experiences elicited from that food, right? So the flavors, the aromas, the texture, all that stuff. And there have been some pretty cool studies indicating that actually brings more attention to the meal. It heightens that sensory experience, and that you retain basically a memory of that kind of plays out over the next few hours. So 2 hours after a protein shake, you might be inclined to say, I really do want something to eat. Whereas 2 hours after a meal with whole foods that required a lot of chewing, maybe had tougher or harder textures, you say, no, I just ate. Like I know I just did that. And that memory is kind of persisting at a subconscious level. And so that's a really fascinating link that I don't like to focus too much on hunger hormones, like gut hormones, when it comes to within the normal physiological range, because they just don't seem to be all that predictive of future energy intake in a lot of studies. But those are the kinds of things that I think are really interesting is when we're leveraging the flavor and the texture and the density of these different foods so that a meal takes longer to eat. We're interacting with it more, we're tasting it more, we're savoring it more. And I think one thing that we can probably do on top of that is actually be very intentional about savoring that meal. So, people talk about mindful eating, and a lot of folks in the evidence-based fitness community say, oh, that's a bunch of, nonsense, a bunch of crap about getting in touch with your feelings and all this other stuff. But there's actually some pretty good science behind mindful eating, what it can do, what it can't do. And I think if slow eating speeds are at least in part acting through that mechanism of, a heightened sensory experience, kind of a lasting memory of that sensory experience, more attention to the meal, we can probably augment that or amplify that by being very intentional about really savoring a meal. And I know it's really tricky because physique athletes are always kind of like, if you talk to someone who doesn't know about bodybuilding and physique sport, they think you're on that line between eating disorder and completely healthy, goal-oriented behaviors, right? And one of the things that pushes people over the edge into like, hey, this is looking more like disordered eating, is eating alone or eating in secret or some of those types of things. And it's very, very different to say, I'm going to eat alone because I'm nervous that people are going to see that I'm eating and judge me and think I'm fat. Totally different to say like, hey, you know what? During this meal, maybe I just want some me time. And I just want to eat this really mindfully and intentionally, really savor this meal, not out of shame, but just out of really enjoying the experience. And maybe I'm going to turn off the TV. I'm not going to listen to a podcast, except the Revive Stronger podcast, obviously. But, back when I used to practice with a local meditation group that did a lot of different mindfulness stuff. And when they go on retreats, they have completely silent meals. They'll still eat with each other, but mealtime is silent. And it's so that they can participate in mindful eating and really savor that meal for what it is. There's socializing time and there's eating time, and it's okay for them to be separate. So I think it's also interesting to modify your eating environment in a way where you can actually pay attention to that meal and frankly, get more out of it in terms of feeling satisfied.
There was a lot there and a lot of good stuff. I really enjoyed that. Everything from the level of processing of the food to the palatability of the food to how you consume the food. I think a lot of the things, and you actually went on to a point which I was going to be like, that's a lot of what bodybuilders end up doing towards the end of prep, where they're like almost protecting over their food and they like very slowly eat it. I know I get into those behaviors where I even getting kind of specific cutlery to make it look like it's bigger in a bowl. You like use a smaller bowl for the same size meal to make it look bigger. Baby spoons, like preppers get into using stuff like that. And it's exactly as you said, I'm kind of sometimes looking at it like how much of this is bordering along helpful behaviors to get you to that goal, but also slightly disordered ways of going about it. And I think, at least in my mind, the key is that you can transition in and out of this. Like it's goal specific. So when you're post show, you can transition back to like normal behaviors or more quote unquote normal, less stressful behaviors and ways of eating that sustains that goal at that time.
Yeah. And you can imagine the scenarios where it looks very different, right? Like leading into a show, you decide, I want to eat the majority of my meals alone without entertainment on so that I can really savor this. And maybe I do use smaller bowls and utensils. There is some evidence indicating that can psychologically kind of make you feel like you've eaten more. Again, getting to that desire to eat versus physiological hunger distinction. But then after a show, if you're saying, well, I want to eat alone because I don't want anyone to see the portions I'm having because I'm embarrassed about it, right? Yeah. I'm self-conscious about it. And, and you feel shame about how much you ate. And, once you start to look at those underlying factors of like, oh, this is not because you're savoring the meal. It's because you're feeling shame. It's because you're embarrassed. And, the distinction between, and again, another indicator there is if you're eating past the point of fullness in secret, embarrassed about portion sizes, embarrassed about your rate of weight gain, clearly we're crossing over into pathological dieting behavior, right? But yeah, if it's a goal-directed behavior and you can go in and out of it, and it's not being driven by shame, it's being driven by, I really think I can win this show. That's a completely different experience.
Yeah, very well said. And I was trying to think of a practical example of what you were kind of talking through there. And it was making me think of kind of Greek yogurt. And you mentioned like putting whey protein powder into it to make it more palatable and kind of enjoy that. But then it's a case of, then you could shift to not having, well, you might just shift to having, people will think about putting artificial sweeteners in things. And so you might go from Greek yogurt with, I don't know, golden syrup over the top. And then you go to Greek yogurt without the golden syrup and an artificial sweetener. But at some point, that's going to still be, you're not getting the calories, but it's so palatable that it's going to drive that kind of food reward response that you kind of talked through. So then you probably want to move to, like, when most people think about 0% fat Greek yogurt and they're not dieting and they're not deep into a diet, it doesn't sound particularly palatable. But if you go there at that point, then again, like, it's just like you said with the chicken, the broccoli that's not particularly cooked well or seasoned well or whatever, you're not going to want to have that much of it.
Yeah. And the thing that's really tricky with artificial sweeteners is that when you dig into this literature, I think there's a blind spot in the literature, if I had to guess, because let's be honest, a lot of this research is being done by obesity researchers who do not know anything about bodybuilding, nor should they. They study obesity, right? But within a special population like bodybuilding, some of these rules, they kind of change a little bit, or at least they can change a little bit. So for example, I did want to mention that there's a few overrated common recommendations for weight loss. A few things that people say, oh, do this when you're struggling with weight loss and it'll make things a little easier. Number one is drink more water. I think I published last month a review in MASS, the MASS Research Review, where there's a meta-analysis, and drinking more water really doesn't seem to move the needle in terms of weight loss efforts. It's still important to stay hydrated, but this idea, if you just Google best fat loss tips or best weight loss tips and go to all the generic websites for the general population, it's crazy how many of them, like, one of their first things they say is drink more water. It doesn't really seem to move the needle if you actually look at the evidence. And what's really interesting in that meta-analysis is that water, I don't know how much I want to look into this finding because there's a very limited number of studies, but in studies where people replaced artificially sweetened beverages with water, so get rid of the Diet Coke, put water there instead, it actually kind of backfired in terms of changes in body mass. And so it was kind of hinting at the idea that, like, for people who are trying to lose some weight, general population folks, maybe they have obesity or high BMI at baseline, that artificially sweetened beverages, that artificially sweetened beverage might actually be better than the same volume of water because it is kind of scratching that itch for them. It's palatable enough and sweet enough that they're not going to then go for the extra dessert after that meal, right? But with bodybuilders, we're in such a strange, unique physiological state that I do think you could argue that there might be an inflection point where that kind of inverts, where it's like, let's just not be someone who consumes a lot of really palatable stuff for a while. Like, let's just kind of, because we're living in phases, because we're a physique athlete, for the last 2 months of prep, maybe palatability is just not our thing, right? Because you could imagine how it's almost like so close, but in the context of extreme restriction, that's all you get, right? So I think that's one that people should play by ear. I know for me personally, like early in a prep, of course, artificially sweetened stuff, it's great. I utilize it, but sometimes I do reach that inflection point where the prep is getting really, really restrictive. And I'm like, I think I'm just going to ride the plain stuff from here on out. I drink water, tea, and coffee with nothing in it. My meals get boring, and boring is good. Boring's predictable. I don't have the ups and downs, the highs and lows of having super palatable this and then really boring that. So artificial sweeteners, I think you want to play that by ear and kind of see how you respond to it. Sometimes it can be helpful. Sometimes it can actually work the other direction because of, those palatability considerations. And then the other overrated piece of advice, in my opinion, people talk up caffeine as a weight loss tool. And I used to be a little bit more bullish about that. I used to be a little bit more like, sure, yeah, go for it. But as time's gone on, I just think it's really tough to find a caffeine dose that's going to be sustainably beneficial in that context without having downsides that outweigh the benefits. Because a lot of times you'll tell someone, hey, just have some caffeine. It'll help as an acute appetite suppressant. And there's some evidence for that in the very short term. But then you check back in with them 4 weeks later and they're drinking like a pot and a half of coffee a day. They sleep like crap, which has a much bigger impact on their hunger and desire to eat than whatever boost they used to be getting from their ever increasing caffeine doses. So they basically habituate to the benefit, but then push the dose up to the point where now they're causing unrelated issues. And if you want to really struggle with hunger and desire to eat, sleep like crap. It will amplify the problem a millionfold. Like it's one of the, if you really want to struggle dieting, sleep terribly and have poorly maintained anxiety. Like if you cannot manage your stress well, if you're struggling to manage your stress and you're struggling to sleep well, and of course the two can be related, they can feed into one another. Stress can make you sleep more poorly, and then poor sleep can make you more susceptible to stress. So it's a nasty, nasty cycle. But once you start getting in that cycle of terrible sleep, high stress, back and forth, your desire to eat goes through the roof. Your ability to manage your appetite tanks. And you start to have, there's all sorts of studies in several different organisms that if you're overstressed and sleeping poorly, your drive to eat hyperpalatable foods goes through the roof. I don't care if you're a bodybuilder or literally a mouse in a cage. We see reliable changes in food preference in that condition. So for that reason and a million other reasons, don't go way overboard with the caffeine. You're going to sleep like crap. If you are prone to stress and anxiety, it very likely will amplify that. And a lot of times it leads you down a road that's not very helpful.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
So well said. I'm really on the same page with caffeine. I've been thinking about it for a while, like with my intake, where I'm just very skeptical that ever the ergogenic benefit is really worth it unless you've got like a competition or something like that that's like your acute performance really matters. Because like you said, people will take it because I don't know, I'm a bit tired, so I'll take it. But then that often hurts sleep and it's a negative feedback loop and they get into this horrible position. Just the same way with hunger as well. You'd be better off prioritizing sleep in every case. So that's really well stated. And the water one's really interesting, and especially that kind of balancing act of when to transition less artificial sweeteners, because it now might be harming you more than it's helping you. That kind of, I guess, relates to the size of calorie deficit, where you can start out a bit more aggressive, taper yourself in. Same with like palatability and things like this. You can kind of, maybe you can have a bit more at the start, but as you get deeper and deeper in, you want to make stuff more and more plain, maybe less and less artificial kind of sweeteners and things, because as you mentioned, bodybuilders back in like 10 years ago, what have you, were making, I don't know, all the Warden farms, like 0 calorie, artificial sweetener, sugar alcohols, and I don't know, a bloated mess. One thing I remember doing, Eric, was, and actually I'd be interested on the point of food volume in calorie per bite and trying to maximize food volume. But I remember making specifically, and I don't know if you've ever done this, hopefully not, but it was a protein fluff, it was called. So
I heard about it. I never tried it.
Yeah, don't try it. I recommend not. It just bloats the hell out of you, basically, because you whisk up loads of air into this protein powder, and you add, I don't know, you can add loads of bits and pieces to it to make it as voluminous as possible. But yeah, I think Pascal maybe even made it, and he called an ambulance because he got such bad bloating, and he thought something had gone wrong, and they were just like,
thought
no,
he
you're
like
just really bloated.
Ruptured appendix or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
so
God.
yeah, I know. So yeah, I'd love to hear kind of similar with the sweeteners. You can take it too far, like, oh, they're going to be helpful for fat loss, but down the line it might lead to such a reward response you end up wanting to just crave and eat more. Same with some of these dietary strategies. Can you take like food volume too far, where that can start just leading to problems?
Sure, you can. I think when we're talking about food volume, we're really in a roundabout way talking a little bit about energy density of a meal, right? And so there's a good article a year or two back, Kevin Hall and some colleagues, I think, where they kind of modeled energy intake in response to different meals with different energy densities. And they ultimately found that, if you can get the energy density of your meal up into the like 1.75 or 2 kilocalories per gram range, so the calories of the meal divided by the mass of the meal in grams, if you can get that above 2-ish, you might be doing yourself some favors in terms of energy intake. But nonetheless, you can, of course, get to a situation where you're still just, you're eating because desire to eat is kind of overriding, the kind of normal satiety signaling. And yeah, you can push it too far where you're just going way overboard with all these kind of satiety boosting low volume foods and just, gorging yourself. And I think one of the nice things about that, not that it's a nice thing about that itself, but it does tend in many cases to be a self-correcting concern. So for example, I just ate like a, several pound enormous bowl of salad and then just felt like absolute crap for 5 hours. You're probably not doing that tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like Pascal's probably not going to have protein fluff for dinner tonight. So you do kind of learn the ropes a little bit. And, I think another place where this happens with bodybuilders is they'll get really into the low calorie alternatives, and they'll learn some really tough lessons about some of the like new age fibers that are like kind of fiber, but they're kind of like these novel kind of lab made fiber alternatives. And then of course the sugar alcohols, which, a lot of these different kinds of fibers that find their way into protein bars and low calorie food items. A lot of these sugar alcohols, they have like just a straight up either a bloating effect or a laxative effect. And so that does tend to be pretty quickly self-correcting, but it is worth keeping an eye on. Like, I think this is more notable after shows than before, but like sometimes people after a show, they're like, well, I'll just eat meals with low energy density, and I'll just eat to my heart's content. Well, your heart has some pretty interesting demands after a competition, right? And so sometimes people will eat these meals and just go way over, and I've been there before. I'm like, well, I'm eating healthy stuff. It's like, yeah, but you ate so much, man. You're going to feel terrible. And so you do have to find that balance. But I think one place where this can be leveraged, this idea of trying to utilize food volume without going too overboard, is with the concept of preloads before a meal. And so, Steve, I know you reached out to me to do this episode because I reviewed an article in Mass that was about, oddly enough, it doesn't sound very appetizing, but gel capsules. So they kind of had participants consume these capsules. Once in the stomach, they expanded in size and basically just took up space in the gut for a period of time. Then they kind of got broken down and eliminated just like any other waste in the GI tract. And when I saw the title of the article in the abstract, I was like, I got to see the adverse events. Like that was my first thing, was like, these people probably were bloated and felt like crap. And how did this impact hydration status? How did this impact diarrhea? All this other stuff. And, in this study so far, this one study, they reported looking at adverse effects very rigorously and really didn't find that it was a particularly unpleasant or non-tolerable intervention. People seem to tolerate it pretty well. And it did seem to have a kind of short-term effect on satiety where people ate less in a subsequent meal. Now, I don't think that that is practical yet. I don't know where in the world you would get these gel capsules. I don't believe they're commercially available yet. I'm curious to keep an eye on it and see if the lack of adverse events or side effects reported, if that's a reliable finding from lab to lab. If it is, great. I think that'd be fantastic. But one thing that is a little more practical that kind of leverages the same concept is the idea of a meal preload. So back in the day, people were doing studies where like, what if we had you drink a liter of water 30 minutes before a meal? Okay, the idea was let's fill up the stomach, get people hydrated, and see if they choose to eat less, in the subsequent 30, 60-minute period. Well, water preloads didn't do that much, but they're just water, right? So then people started looking into protein preloads. Have a protein shake 30 minutes before. Evidence looked a little bit better for protein preloads. My personal favorite preload, if you're going to do a liquid version, is I actually found a whey protein supplement that's like orange mango flavored. And I mix in Metamucil, which is soluble fiber, which again, once it mixes with water, it kind of increases in volume, forms this kind of gel, almost like some of these gel capsules would, but to a lesser degree. And so I actually do that sometimes 30 or 60 minutes before a meal. I'll have 40 grams of whey protein, a scoop or two of Metamucil. And that's a fairly practical way to approach a preload. And then with your meal, the reason I do this, frankly, I started doing it is because now I'm a vegetarian. And now that I work on a university campus again, there's all these like meals and stuff where food's prepared. And I'm like, all right, well, if I'm going to get 30 or 40 grams of protein as a vegetarian, I'm going to have to eat like a 3,000 calorie meal based on this spread that's for omnivores, right? Like there's not a lot of like really efficient protein sources that are going to be available to me. So instead of eating a huge meal so I can try to seek out a decent amount of protein and fiber, I do that beforehand. And then the meal, I'm just looking for some nice little tasty things and eating socially, right? But so if I'm doing liquid preloads, I do protein plus fiber, specifically soluble fiber because of the characteristics I just mentioned. But if you really wanted to leverage this concept even more, I think you could do a very vegetable heavy preload with vegetables with low energy density. And again, like you said, we don't want to have this backfire and get all bloated and overeat a bunch of vegetables beyond the point of comfort. But I do speculate that it would be potentially useful for someone who really struggles with overeating at mealtime. Perhaps 30 or 60 minutes before a meal, you put together some of your favorite vegetables and or fruits with low energy density. So we're thinking like, cucumbers, carrots, celery, all the sorts of stuff with super low energy density, even watermelon if you wanted to, and just kind of, get some volume in your stomach, not an uncomfortable amount. But then 30 or 60 minutes later, you have your meal with the more calorically dense food items, and perhaps you end up choosing to consume a little bit less without putting a lot of effort and intentional constraint behind those choices.
Yeah, I really like that. It reminds me of something I used to do. I haven't done it in a long time, but it was iceberg lettuce. I used to have one of those in the fridge. And whenever I just had this hunger that wouldn't go away and it wasn't time to eat a meal, I would just like chop half of it, put a little bit of salsa on, which has barely any calories, and just eat that. And that kind of filled a hole, essentially. But it's like you said, you get to this point where you can easily push it too far because you just want to stuff yourself. But I like that you mentioned it can kind of be autoregulative in that sense. The only other concern I have about it is some people I think consistently don't pull back because they want this stuffed effect. Is there any research looking at like stretching of the stomach? Like, is there some concern of that? Because I even think of like on a refeed day, people might do that. Okay, I'm just going to increase the amount of food that I'm already eating. They're already on the cusp of what's discomfort and kind of reaching their kind of, threshold for that. And then they go overboard. Could that end up stretching the stomach over the process? And therefore you don't get as much satiety from the other meals because they don't fill that hole in the same way. I know you know that. I just wanted to explain my point.
That's an interesting question. I'd have to look into that. And honestly, I think the place to look into that is I'd be curious to sit down with a competitive eater and learn more about their training process. Because I have heard but not verified or looked into the idea that they do, some of these training sessions where they just eat a tremendous volume of something like lettuce or something, right? I'd like to assess the veracity of that. And then, man, that'd be a really fun study, is just to get in there with like MRI or ultrasound and look at longitudinally over, 6 weeks of training for a big competition. What happens to some of those GI tract tissues? I would love to do a study like that. But the GI tract can change, certainly in volume, in response to changes in volume of food intake. And that's when, we did a study back in the day when I was working on my PhD with bariatric surgery patients. And one of the challenges with bariatric surgery, it's a very, very effective weight loss method, but there is a percentage of individuals who regain a tremendous amount of weight, because even after you depending on which type of surgery you do, there's a lot of ways to do it, but ultimately you're reducing the size of the stomach. You can do it with a sleeve, there's different types of surgical options. But ultimately, if you consistently overfeed relative to the volume of that newly shrunken stomach, it will expand over time. So that's one of the reasons that I kind of like going in with a delicate approach and just saying, like, I'm going to do a preload where I'm just going to, it's not like I'm going to like dramatically fill my stomach. Like, this is the meal before the meal. But what it's doing is almost like the way that we think of a supplement as kind of the icing on the cake for a meal, or for our diet. I think of like, I'm going to lay the foundation for a diet that has low energy density before I get to that meal, or lay the foundation for a low energy density meal before I get there, so that I have a little bit more flexibility with my food choices at the main meal. So I do think you're probably on to something with the idea that if you're doing really high volume stuff, and you're doing it to an extent that is actually like really meaningfully filling the stomach, there could be some diminishing returns on that type of strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always just something I know I've tried to do, at least with my refeeds, is not just have more of this bulk that's going to end up just, again, it's going to make me uncomfortable. I've kind of found, I don't know if you find this, you have a number for yourself, Eric, but I know 50 grams at the moment of fiber is like my cap. If I go over that, I know I'm going to be in trouble the next day and uncomfortable. But if I just stay around 45 or so, I know I'm okay.
Yeah, no, I can handle, my number is actually probably closer to 70. Like I can really pack away the fiber, and feel great, and it also depends the type of fiber, right? Soluble versus insoluble can be very different. But nonetheless, I like what you're saying about refeeds, and that's something I also do in prep. If I'm going to be doing a big prep, I'll actually start that prep by intentionally seeking out foods with high energy density and low food volume, because my idea of a perfect prep is that I look down at my plate at the beginning and the end, and it looks similar in terms of the amount of food there. But what has changed is I have diluted that diet. I've gone from filling my plate with a bunch of energy dense foods, and over time I'm swapping. At the end of the day, my plate still looks full at the end of prep, but the food selection is very different. And, I've talked in previous podcasts and stuff about the best prep I ever did. I didn't count calories or protein. I know I ate a lot of protein, but I did purely qualitative swaps throughout the entire prep. So I mean this very literally. I had a bowl that was for dinner every night. And at the beginning of prep, I filled the bowl with stuff that had a lot of calories. And toward the end of prep, I filled the bowl with a bunch of stuff that didn't have a lot of calories, and it's really surprising how psychologically that can really go a long way towards saying, this ain't so bad. It's still just a bowl of food at night. But the actual, it's not like it's not like I didn't notice, right? Like I noticed, right? It feels different, but way more psychologically enjoyable for a contest prep to just not worry so much about all the little granular details and kind of keep that food volume constant.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. You mentioned being coached and then self-coaching. I said I could go down a rabbit hole here, but just on that point, Cliff Wilson he's doing my nutrition, and I can already tell you how much of a stress reduction that has been. It's unbelievable, in fact. I didn't think it would even have this much, where I could just shoot him what's happened for the week. He tells me what to eat, basically, and I just go eat that. I'm like, great. Yeah. Don't have to worry about the timeline. Am I losing enough? He tells me what to do, and I'm good. So I can totally see that just removing as many of those stressful things can be a huge win. And Alberto Nunez recently did a prep where he was for virtually the whole thing, if not the whole thing, not tracking. And so I can see why you would, because I think a lot of people look at that, why would you choose that route? It's less known, but actually it could reduce stressors that could enhance your result.
Sure. And, I knew I was eating enough protein, and I mean, heck, you look at the Minnesota starvation experiment. If you give someone 1,600 calories a day and you have them stay active, we know where that's going, right? They're going to get lean, right? And so for me, I was like, all right, well, I'll just make some swaps. And if things start slowing down, make more swaps and rinse and repeat and keep going. And yeah, I mean, like I said, a lot of times we kind of get really stressed over, should I be eating 2,100 calories or 2,200 calories right now? And I'm like, do you even know how many calories you burn every day? Are you sure it's not varying by 100 here, 100 there? Are you sure that if you're doing flexible dieting that the food labels you're using are perfectly accurate? Like, do you really think every day you're eating the same number of calories if you're swapping food sources? Because you're almost certainly not. And even if you are you sure that you're actually extracting the same amount of energy from the gut based on those different food sources? So I think sometimes it can be helpful to zoom out and tell people like, okay, we're going to do this as best we can. And there is value if someone says, hey, I'm really struggling. Like, okay, maybe we're dieting too fast. Maybe we can add some calories. That's always useful. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to prep. And it doesn't always have to be super quantitatively driven in a way that is highly, highly focused on the details. Like there are times where if it's really doing more harm than good, you can just zoom out and say, I know what happens when people underfeed for 7 months and lift weights and eat a lot of protein, right?
Yeah, I absolutely concur your message completely. There's one other thing I have, at least in my notes, if you're happy to talk about it. I don't know how much you would like to, but it's how impactful you feel like the element of chrononutrition is. So kind of related to the circadian rhythm and kind of that eating clock, as it were, timing of meals in relation to your body's clock. Does that play much of a role in your book?
I think that you can make the case that for health purposes, cardiometabolic health, there is a case to be made for biasing calories early in the day and having a decently long fasting period from dinner of day 1 to breakfast of day 2. I think there is literature hinting at that is worth consideration for someone who wishes to optimize their cardiometabolic health. However, I expect the effect of that, even for cardiometabolic health, to be quite small, especially in someone who is already doing stuff right. So if you are a person who maintains a healthy body weight, who eats an appropriate amount of total energy, who has an appropriate breakdown of macronutrients, who consumes a generally healthy diet, who sleeps well, I think I said this already, but who's pretty active, physically active. If you're doing all that stuff, man, you're really talking about, I really want to live from, I want to extend my lifespan from 84.9 years to 85.2. And like for me personally, take it or leave it. It was probably not my best days, those last those last couple months in my 80s or 90s, right? So I think that effect is probably really modest in terms of cardiometabolic health, but I can't, I'm not going to just throw out the evidence that does exist, especially in populations that are kind of higher risk for cardiometabolic complications. For physique purposes, I don't really think it matters. What I do think matters is, for physique purposes, playing around, experimenting with the trade-off between meal size and meal frequency. I think there are some people I've talked to who they prefer to have more of a grazing type diet. It helps them feel like they're never too far away from the next meal. Psychologically, it helps them to have more smaller meals. I know people that are the exact opposite. I'm one of them. I prefer to feel satisfied after a meal, and I'm gifted and cursed in that I love the work I do. I can get busy and forget that food exists, even when dieting. If I just say, hey, food's over for the day, get to work and kind of forget about it, right? So I actually prefer to have fewer meals that are larger when dieting. And I actually do prefer to do kind of like an intermittent, I should say time restricted feeding / intermittent fasting kind of deal, where I do like to just put all my food in like an 8-hour feeding window and then just get away from food. But I prefer to put my feeding window later in the day. And the reason for that is it's all psychological, right? But I am more stressed by the idea of running out of calories for the day than any benefit I could possibly obtain from early time restricted feeding, right? So I don't like to finish all my food for the day at 3 p.m. and say, I hope I don't get hungry in the next 8 hours, right? I would much prefer to say, I'm busy this morning. I have my morning coffee and I'm doing stuff. I'm getting to work. All of a sudden noon rolls around. Hey, it's eating time, right? And for me, that's just psychologically a little bit more tolerable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's the way I've kind of viewed it as well. If there is an impact, I imagine it's relatively small. And the restricted window of eating is an interesting one as well. I'm more of a 12-hour eating window, but I do push back my breakfast, and that seems to be the biggest thing. And then I don't like to eat too close to bedtime. That's at least one thing. I guess this is more on the topic of sleep, but that does have a role, I guess, in appetite. But I've noticed if I have too many calories late in the day, even when dieting, that tends to disrupt my sleep a little bit. So I like 2 hours before bed to try not to eat too much. Massing, it's even worse. Like, that's a no-go for me. If I have a large chunk of calories, then I know my sleep's going to be horrendous.
Yeah, and with prep, it's hard too, because if you try to go to bed hungry, a lot of times that interferes with sleep, right? So with prep, you have to kind of figure out like how close is close enough, but not too close. And like, especially like I'm someone who eats a lot of spicy food. A big spicy meal an hour before bed, you're going to sleep like crap, right? Most likely. So yeah, you're right. There is that trade-off where you have to figure out the proper placement and duration of the feeding window in ways that are psychologically tolerable for you and in ways that are facilitating high quality sleep.
Yeah, I think you've done an excellent job here rounding up nutrition for the most part. I have a part on supplementation. I don't know if you have time for it or if you have many thoughts on, like you said, supplements are the sprinkles on top of the well-rounded diet. But is there much there for fat loss in your book?
Honestly, no. Like I said, I've really turned on caffeine as a fat loss facilitator. And if you look at most like fat burner supplements or thermogenic supplements or diet related supplements in general, a lot of them are like caffeine plus a mix and match list of, poorly supported herbal ingredients. Not saying there can't be anything out there that works. I just haven't come across it. And I just think that there's much more impactful stuff we can do. I will say, I do think that if you're someone who is under eating fiber, then a soluble fiber supplement like a Metamucil or like a psyllium husk based supplement may be advantageous in some contexts, particularly as like a preload, like I mentioned previously. But supplements, I don't think is there any particular supplement that you had in mind that you think is popular or perhaps worth considering?
Two popular ones, I would say. One that I've not really taken much stock of. I haven't looked into a ton, but L-Carnitine, particularly, it seems to be, I don't know, on social media, a lot of people are injecting liquid L-Carnitine, which I think is interesting, especially as a natural, like injecting anything. It's always like a bit of a funny thing for me. But yeah, that's one that some people are doing.
Yeah. Do you know what the proposed mechanism is?
Unfortunately not. It's just one I've heard floating around. I haven't been able to find much on liquid, particularly L-Carnitine.
Yeah, I'll look into that. That's really interesting. I've generally not been fond of carnitine for the previous iterations of what it's supposed to do. People have always talked about it helping with fat burning. I find that to be very unconvincing looking at the evidence. People have talked about it as something that facilitates recovery like muscle recovery after training. I also found that evidence to be pretty underwhelming and unconvincing, but yeah, I'll definitely look into that. But I agree with you. I'm not really fond of, as a natural athlete, getting any needles out. It's not really my thing. And I'm fine with needles. Like
I'm bad with needles.
I'm fine with needles. I find it weird to be putting things like I used to do all the blood draws in my lab. I'd teach people how to do them, and I even would do them on myself. That was like my little party trick, is like I can draw my own blood from my antecubital vein. So it's not like needles make me squeamish. I'm like, why am I injecting stuff as a natural athlete? It doesn't really work for me. But yeah, I will say this though. So supplements, I'm not really that into, but if I could introduce very briefly a couple things that I think are worth considering that don't fall under the umbrella of things we already talked about. And this is where I want to be really clear. I'm getting a bit speculative in terms of impact here. So we are drawing a line between the evidence-based stuff and now the Eric kind of iterating on evidence and maybe speculating a little bit. One thing I think is worth considering, and I've written about this in mass so many times, but I think it's really powerful to adopt an acceptance-oriented approach to hunger when you're dieting. So we can do all this stuff to try to reduce hunger or desire to eat, and that is a worthwhile endeavor. But I do think the most important thing you can do when dieting is start out with an acceptance-based approach and say, okay, we're going to do some goal-oriented dieting. Hunger is likely to be a part of that process, and hunger is a very fortunate thing that we have baked into our genetic code from an evolutionary perspective. It's good that we experience hunger and desire to eat when we're underfed. And that's something I'm going to experience. And if you can kind of frame it mentally as a marker of successful goal striving, then that can be a really good thing. So the hunger is not working against your goal. The hunger is a marker of making strides toward your goal. I think that can be a really powerful way to kind of reframe hunger in your mind so that you don't fear it. You know, like, and I know I sound like a hypocrite because I told you I don't like to finish my calories for 3 p.m. and then say, crap, what if I get hungry at 8, right? So being a hypocrite, but it's still very valuable if you can kind of work yourself to a place where you accept hunger and work around it rather than trying to hide from it your entire diet. Two other things that, well, I already mentioned the idea of good sleep quality and good stress management. I think there's really strong evidence there with regards to reducing desire to eat, instances of emotional eating, just bolstering our ability to kind of power through some of those instances where if we were underslept or poorly managing stress, we might be inclined to overeat. But the two things that I think are really getting more speculative, the first two, there's actually some pretty decent evidence. Number one is incorporating little bouts of physical activity when experiencing acute instances of hunger. Because like Steve, we've all had those instances of hunger throughout the day where it's like you get hungry at noon, you don't do anything about it, and by 1 p.m. you're not hungry anymore. And you're like, where'd it go? Right? It's kind of weird. But that's different from the hunger that you get when it's like you get it at 6 p.m. and it just like lingers and lingers and lingers and lingers, right? But in any case, I think it can be useful, especially for those kind of fickle instances of hunger that come and go. Instead of reacting by saying, okay, I'm going to have a snack or move my next meal up a couple hours, to just engage in a very quick little bout of physical activity. It could be a walk around the block. It could be, if you're at work, I'm going to go up and down the stairwell a few times. Exercise can have an acute impact on hunger and desire to eat that can be really helpful in those types of scenarios. So not only are you staving off that little fickle bout of hunger, but you're also making some strides toward getting your steps in for the day, right? So I think exercise more frequently in little tiny bouts can sometimes be helpful to mitigate some of those instances. And the one that I'm going to put out there that is extremely speculative, I hesitate to bring it up almost, but I enjoy sauna bathing, not because of all the like biohacker pseudoscience that's getting popularized, not because of all the dramatically overstated benefits, but I find it to be pleasant. I like sitting in a sauna, okay? But I will admit that one thing I notice when I'm routinely sauna bathing, doing it consistently, is that at least for a few hours after sauna, I don't really have a high desire to eat. The same way that you might notice on a cold winter day, you're more likely to want a big, warm, fatty meal versus in the heat of the summer when you're like, I just want a glass of water. I can't even think about eating right now. And there is research indicating that core temperature as it goes up generally does interact with appetite to some extent. And so like people have talked about, oh, you should do cold exposure and then your brown fat activates and then you're going to lose fat. Well, what we find is that cold induced thermogenesis is usually counteracted by equal or disproportionately larger hunger responses in response to that cold stressor. But heat stressors actually do seem to diminish appetite acutely without much of a like really substantial rebound afterward. So of course I hesitate to bring this up because it has to be done so carefully. Heat stress can and will kill you if you don't do it correctly. So I'm not suggesting that you should just bake yourself and kind of use that as a crutch throughout prep. But I do think it's interesting to at least consider, I've always liked to prep during warmer months for a million reasons. You're going to be cold during prep because your thyroid hormone is going to drop if you do it right. It's just going to happen. But also, it can be really helpful to prep during warmer months. And I wonder if heat stress has something to do with it. I think that sauna bathing safely on a regular basis can be a really relaxing thing that can be nice. And I have just noticed that sometimes I can kind of strategically use it to manage my appetite a little bit better during periods where I've increased hunger. So again, a million caveats. That's very speculative. It's based on a granule of evidence and science. And the most important thing is not to use that irresponsibly. Because like I said, heat stress is not to be messed with. It can be very, very dangerous if it's not applied in a very thoughtful and judicious manner.
I think these additional points are really interesting, although, like you said, maybe not strongly held in evidence. I think a lot of the listeners may have listened to this and they're very aware of one of the things that have been brought up or they're reminded of them. But these ones are things that I think maybe they haven't thought of and they can try, so they can be beneficial in that sense. And I know that acceptance of hunger is a huge one for me. It's something that I end up recommending and kind of embracing it. Like you said, it's like, oh, if I'm tired, I'm fatigued, I should be. It's kind of like, right, I'm doing calorie deficit. If I wasn't feeling this way, maybe I'd kind of have some doubts there. The exercise one's really interesting. And I would say it kind of aligns with one that I think of is, like you said, when you're busy, you just don't think about food. And man, for me, being busy is huge because quite often I'm just bored and then I want to eat. It happens to me on weekends when I'm just like, I don't know, sat lounging, watching TV. I'm like, why am I constantly thinking about food? That other weekend when I was walking around the shops or the city or whatever, didn't think about it once. It was so easy.
Again. Yeah. And again, that's the hunger versus desire to eat.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the sauna one's really interesting. I only know about saunas, some of the health benefits being it can help excrete some of like the, I don't know if it's like the heavy metals or whatever that we can sometimes hold on to within our body. And so it can help with that sort of thing. But it's very big, like in the biohacker sphere.
Yeah. And that's why I'm so nervous to embrace it because I feel like I'm just going to get roped into all the less defensible claims about it. But no, I mean, I love sauna bathing. I really got hooked on it after visiting Finland. And I'm like, man, these folks love sauna. And then I tried it and I was like, yeah, this is pretty great. They were right. But like I said, I like to use it for enjoyment. It helped out a little bit with, I had an injury and my blood pressure was a little high. And so I couldn't do the amount of cardio I'd like to do. And I actually found that it helped as kind of I would have much preferred to just do cardio to manage my blood pressure, but I couldn't. And so it was kind of a better than nothing alternative to help bring my blood pressure down a little bit, along with just like better stress management. So there are some real benefits for the cardiovascular system. And one of the things that's interesting is, like I said, there's a really cool review paper about different temperature related stresses and effects on energy intake and appetite. And like I said, cold stress usually backfires when you try to use it as any kind of a fat loss technique, and it just sucks. It's horrible. We did a study years ago where we were studying brown adipose tissue, and we had to activate it. And so we had to basically make people cold, but not to the point of shivering. Because once you shiver, now there's a new additional thermogenic impact of the muscle activity. And it sucked. No one, like, when people say, oh, I'll just be cold and that'll turn on my brown adipose tissue, as if it's this like, there's no downside or cost to it. It's like, dude, it sucks. If you're actually getting cold enough to meaningfully induce that, it's very uncomfortable. It's not fun. But anyway, yeah, the cold stress is really not a super viable option for facilitating appetite management or fat loss, but heat stress is really interesting. And I do wonder, to some extent, I don't think it is fully the same thing, but I do wonder, especially when people talk about like doing really high intensity bouts of exercise and then having no appetite for an hour or two after it, I would be curious about the combined impact of increased thermogenic activity of muscle, to, increasing heat production. I do wonder if that factors in addition to lactate and other metabolites that likely do also impact appetite and desire to eat. So it's one of those areas where I'm really curious to see to what extent heat might play into some of the clinical terms, like the anorexic effects, the acute anorexic effects of exercise. Anorexic meaning just blunting of appetite. I'd be, like I said, I don't have strong evidence for it, but I do suspect that increased thermogenic activity of muscle, at least plays a tiny role in that appetite blunting after high intensity activity. But I don't at all doubt that there are key metabolites that factor in as well.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's unfortunate talking about prepping in summer. In the UK, the big shows are always at the end of the year. So, and I know WNBF Worlds, which is what I'm gunning for, is in Boston in November, I think. So it's going to be freezing cold. So that's not going to be helpful.
Yeah, for me, I think the perfect time for a competition is like August, maybe September, right? So the hardest part of prep is happening during the heat of the summer. That's what you want. And then you have a great season, you win a bunch of shows. And then during, in the US, it's kind of like the holiday season, November, December into January. You relax, you have all the good treats, and you enjoy all your success. So that's kind of the perfect schedule. But yeah, in America, a lot of times they'll have these competitions that happen in like April. And I'm like, dude, you think I'm going to be prepping in February? Like, that's terrible. Like, absolutely not. So yeah, I've always, every competitive season I've ever done, for a variety of reasons, I think every competitive season I've done, I've competed in like one of the early fall shows, or a string of shows that's like late summer, early fall, just because mostly that fit my schedule as someone who works in universities on an academic timeline. But also it is just infinitely better to prep during the summer.
Yeah, I agree. Just to quickly touch back to supplements. So I just wanted to say on the L-Carnitine, there's been 2 metas done on it. And especially if you're not obese, the impacts are incredibly small, at least for non-injected liquid. I can't speak to that. But the other one, if you would like to speak about it, is related to Yohimbine. I don't know if you have tried it, if you have any thoughts on that one.
Yeah.
Because it seems to be one that is touted as like evidence-based, but when I looked into it, I was like, oh, I'm actually surprised how little studies there are on it, but there are some like quite convincing studies.
Yeah. It's one of those interesting supplements where you're like, okay, if these first studies were reported such intriguing effects, why aren't there many more? And the reason that when someone tells me I think Yohimbine helps me with fat loss, I actually don't reject that as a possibility. Like I said, there is a tiny bit of evidence there to lean on. But I personally would not use Yohimbine, nor do I instruct people to use it, because it just doesn't have a great adverse effect profile. So like there is some reasonably decent evidence that if you're using Yohimbine in a fasted state, doing like after an overnight fast, using Yohimbine before like morning cardio or something, that it may help out a little bit with fat loss. But a lot of people report clinically meaningful anxiety responses to it. And there are papers about a number of emergency room visits from people who took too much Yohimbine. And so then you would say, well, hey, that's your fault, take less. But then you find other papers documenting just a really widespread lack of quality control with Yohimbine supplements, which may not even be the fault of the individuals who are formulating and distributing the supplements. It could be linked all the way back to the raw material that they're getting from the kind of manufacturers of just like the basic Yohimbine that's getting purchased by supplement companies down the supply chain that are then mixing it with other ingredients into a formula. So the thing that's really tricky is it's really hard, I think, to be certain that you're getting a properly dosed Yohimbine supplement. And then of course, another barrier is because of the adverse event profile and the number of, emergency room calls and things like that, hospitalizations, different areas have banned it from being sold as a dietary supplement, or at least like the most effective form of it has been banned in many jurisdictions. I think in the UK it's not banned. You can get, pretty.
I've never actually looked to buy it. I don't actually know, because I'm same to you. I'm like, the adverse risk, like the risk profile is just not there for me.
Yeah, but when you for example look at like, oh, I'm going to make a supplement, formulate it, and I'm going to market it to the United States, Canada, the UK, and Australia. I know at least some of them, your formula is going to be totally fine, and in others, you're going to have to jump through all sorts of hoops, or maybe use a form that's less effective but not yet banned. So all of that is to say, I'm just not a Yohimbine guy, especially as someone, like I said, like I tend to have a little bit higher than you want blood pressure, and maybe, could use a little bit of extra stress reduction, anxiety reduction. And so for me, any product that it's like, hey, this might make you really stress out and have a bunch of anxiety, I'm like, I don't want that. Like, I don't have these meditation bowls behind me because I want to be stressed out all the time. Right.
I'm the same with you on that. And as I looked into it, it's actually interesting. In addition to everything you mentioned, the way it's metabolized can vary by a factor of 1,000. So it's like, if you're gonna try it, definitely try and start with the lower dose, because you could be that person that's on that end of the spectrum where it just impacts you wildly. So I forgot also potential for medication interactions as well. So that's another one. So like variation between individuals in terms of how they metabolize it. You can mix in variation induced by drug interactions, and then on top of that, mix in potential mislabeling issues or differences in purity from one product to another, and the totality of that makes it potentially a kind of unpredictable thing. Yeah, fantastic. Eric, I just want to finish on a more fun question. What are your go-to diet foods?
Man, that's tricky, because I've since the last time I prepped, I went like very vegetarian and like borderline vegan with a few little exceptions. So all my foods have changed, but I will say like a classic that you can't overlook is riced cauliflower. Absolutely wonderful diet food. As someone who really likes I like Indian cuisine. I like a lot of different Asian cuisines. Cauliflower rice, mix it with a good sauce and a good spice profile, it can go a long way.
Nice. Yeah, I haven't done rice cauliflower in ages. I will say the last time I remember, I am eating cauliflower regularly because it's part of my just vegetable intake, my frozen vegetable mix that I eat. But the last time I ate cauliflower as not just cauliflower, like cauliflower rice, I would mix it in. I think the ratio was like 20 to 30 grams of oats, which is a really, really low amount of oats, with like a head of cauliflower to try and make some like cauliflower oats and really stretch it out. Yeah, at that point, you're deep into prep.
Oh yeah, but I have made mashed cauliflower, like mimicking mashed potatoes, and even people who don't diet, they were pretty convinced. But I put a lot of cream cheese and cheese into it. So at that point, I'm like, are we sure this trade-off really, really mattered in terms of the total calories? So yeah, but cauliflower, if you're creative, you can really do a lot with it.
It doesn't taste that strong most of the time, so you can hide it pretty well. And
if anything, it's got a plain, but almost like a bit of to me, almost like a bit of a buttery kind of sense to it. Like like especially the rice cauliflower I get, it almost, sometimes I'm like, did they like butter this very lightly? But I don't think they did. So rice cauliflower is great. And at least where I get my groceries, you can get it in bulk. So just like giant microwave ready packets of rice cauliflower. And I'm so lazy that is easily like a quick go-to.
Yeah, nice. Perfect. Eric, thank you so much for your time. I think this has been a fantastic episode, and I think people are going to take a lot away from it. If people want to keep up to date with you, you mentioned the Master Research Review, which there's been multiple studies here which have been reviewed in there. So I definitely recommend that. That's always linked in our description for people to go ahead and join that. We're a proud affiliate over here at Revive Stronger, but you're also part of the Iron Culture podcast now, like official part of the crew. Where else should they? So if they like podcasts and they want to hear more from you, definitely head there. But where else should they head?
Yeah, Mass Iron Culture, and then just my personal Instagram, which is at Trexler Fitness.
Thank you so much again. And guys, we'll catch you soon. Take care.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality and we know how to do it. And we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.